tonight is Marxism and Repression, and I want to really go through what I think we mean by oppression and what the relationship between capitalism and repression is and how we can overcome it. Because if you look at how we define capitalism itself, we talk about capitalism as having a fundamental conflict between two classes in society. There's the capitalist class, as Marx calls it, the bourgeoisie, and there's the working class, the proletariat, the class without any property. And that's a kind of a model which is absolutely fundamental to any understanding of capitalism, and the relationship between the two classes is what's called the relationship of exploitation. And it involves one class literally screwing, that's not literally screwing, not literally screwing, we'll come on to that I suppose with the not literally, but actually, figuratively, screwing the other class. And it does so through a process whereby a worker works and produces the wealth in society and produces a certain amount of wealth. In return, the worker, she or he, only receives a certain portion of that wealth, and the difference between what they get as wages is only just enough to cover the costs of their reproduction. The difference between that and the wealth that they produces the profits for the capitalists. That's the basic way in which capitalism works, and that's Marx used the term surplus value to explain that and to say this is what it meant. Now that's the very straightforward definition of capitalism and of the working class and the capitalist class. But of course, life isn't so straightforward when you look at the real picture of what society looks like, because it doesn't look like, you know, one class over here which understands it as being exploited, another class which understands quite clearly, a much smaller class, but which understands it is exploiting people. The working class itself looks incredibly divided. You know, if you look at the working class, what do you find? You find it's divided between men and women, it's divided in terms of race and nationality, it's divided over questions, sometimes over seemingly not central questions, for example language, sometimes is something that can divide working people, and all these things, sexuality, all these different issues are things which can divide the working class. And oppression really is, you find that there are all these groups within the working class, within society as a whole, because of course they're not just confined to the working class. You have a very small number of blacks and women who are part of the ruling class, very small number, but nonetheless you do have them. You have a much bigger number who you could say are part of the middle class, for want of a better term. And then within the working class itself, of course, you have unevenness in terms of how these different groups of people are treated. If you look in this country, for example, it is absolutely clear that women earn only, at best, women earn only 4/5 of what men earn. This is still the situation today. And actually, for lots of women, they are, particularly part-time women, for example, they earn far, far less. If you look at black people, black and Asian people who are part of the working class in this country, tend to earn lower wages, not because they have the same sort of discrimination across the board that you get with women, but because they tend to be segregated into certain jobs, which tend to be the most unpleasant, the most strenuous, the least valued jobs, and the ones that, surprise, surprise, are paid the least money. So you have this oppression, different groups of the oppressed. Actually, you find them within the working class, but not equal within the working class. And this is a factor which has gone on for a very long time. If you look at women's oppression, certainly it predates capitalist society. It goes back thousands of years. It goes back as long as class society. As soon as you had society divided into classes, and as soon as therefore a minority began to catch hold of the wealth and to keep hold of the wealth, so you also had a group of people who maintained their wealth and their power through the family, through the state, through all these kind of things. But I would argue that what capitalism does, although women's oppression predates capitalism and predates it by throughout most of human society, it's only when you talk about very early societies, you talk about an egalitarian society where women and men, there's no stigma particularly in being a woman. But I would argue that capitalism actually recreates women's oppression in a very, very specific way. It does so through creating the institution of the modern nuclear family, an institution which is based on the idea that women not only work, which they increasingly now do outside the home, but also that women have responsibility for childcare, for housework, for all these things. Now, while much of this responsibility has changed, if you look at the 21st century, for example, it's very different from the 19th century, and crucially it's different in the sense that married women and mothers go out to work now in a way that they tended not to in these earlier periods. But it is actually an institution which is at the centre of women's oppression, in the sense it is the place where women's roles outside of the family are defined. Their roles as mothers, as wives, as people who somehow play a caring role in society. Their roles are defined in terms of, there is a hidden assumption with women's wages that somehow they don't need to earn the same as men because they're not breadwinners of the family. And there is an assumption as well that women will be the primary carers. Now, if you think about this in capitalist society, this is a fantastic benefit, above all, to the capitalist class. The capitalist class, if it had to pay for the reproduction of the next generation of workers, the bringing up of children, the caring of children, the educating and training and skilling of children, all of which is done at virtually no cost to the state, very little cost to the state. If you look at child benefit, it's a very small part of the cost of bringing up children. This is done at virtually no cost to the state and with huge amounts of input from members of the family, not just the woman. You know, the men will put a lot of effort into it, other members of the family will put a lot of effort into it, but it's essentially there in order to, essentially you have the reproduction of labour power, the bringing up of the next generation of workers is hived off to the family. It's not something that the capitalist state takes responsibility for, it's not something that it pays for in any great measure, and it's something that people do within the family, by and large, out of the sense that they want to do this and that they feel this is something that is worthwhile. And therefore within the family you have this economic relationship, you have a social relationship between the husband and the wife and the children and so on. It's a very hierarchical relationship. You also have the teaching of images of women has its roots in the family as well, in the sense that there are a whole series of images of women, some of which are projected as bad in society and some of which are projected as good, which is normally being, you know, loving wives and mothers and obedient and caring and all these kind of things. These images, which go right through our lives, through advertising and all this kind of thing, come very, very much from the family. And of course, women's oppression within the family doesn't just remain with women. If you look at lesbian and gay oppression, if you look at the way in which people's sexuality is treated and the way in which they're oppressed, actually this stems from the idea of the nuclear family, the idea that a heterosexual couple is superior, the idea that there are so-called masculine values which are about strength and security and all this kind of thing, and so-called feminine values which are about the opposite, passivity and, you know, warmth and caring and all the things that we know all we women are so good at. So that, you know, you look at the attitudes towards sexuality, towards gender, towards all these things in capitalist society, you see it stemming from this economic relationship, this absolutely central economic relationship, which is the nuclear family. If you look at the other main oppression in capitalist society, which is kind of oppression based on race or nation and those kind of things, I would argue this much more is something which arises with capitalism and which is something that capitalism is very, very much responsible for. And if you look at ideologies of racism, they are based very, very much on the justification of slavery. And if you look at the history of British capitalism and a number of other capitalisms around the world. They were built on slavery, which systematically transported black people from Africa to the Caribbean and to the United States in order to work, to produce the wealth in those particular countries. If you look at the wealth of London, was created in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and slavery was absolutely central to that. Now, when you do this to a whole race of people, you have to relegate them to people who are subhuman. You cannot justify the buying and selling of individual human beings, the rape that takes place on a massive scale, all these other kind of things, without saying that these people somehow are inferior to us. And if you look at the basis of racist ideology, it relies very, very much on that. As does the whole nationalist ideology based on the colonial system, empire, the idea that some nations are superior, because they have bigger armies or they have bigger warships, all these kind of things, that some nations are superior. You have the development of these ideologies which are about creating divisions within society, and for our purposes, creating divisions inside the working class. So you have these going on, and of course, when you have these oppressions, which are the systematic discrimination against groups of people because of their race or their gender or any other characteristics about them, then this is something which affects working class people very badly because it weakens the working class. If you look at what happens with oppressed groups in, let's say, in Britain and in many, many other societies, actually the impact of oppression on working class unity is actually to weaken working class unity. That you have people working for lower wages, you have people working in segregated labour markets, you have groups of people who are seen as a reserve army of labour so they can be brought into work when there's a boom and thrown out of work when there isn't one, and you can be scapegoated, and you know, when white workers in this country complain there aren't jobs or don't get high enough wages, they're told, well, the answer to that is that you should be getting these wages, but the black person who lives next door to you, or the Polish immigrant who lives next door to you, or any of these people shouldn't be getting these kind of wages. Now this reduces and weakens the unity inside the working class, because it isn't just a question for the working class, because it's more complicated than that. You have working class. Actually, the vast majority of the oppressed in Britain and in most societies are members of the working class. If you think most gays, most women, most blacks and Asians, most Poles and other nationalities are people who are part of the working class, and therefore should identify with the working class, and other working class people should identify with them. But it's complicated because oppression also cuts across classes. You know, if you were a Chinese person, when the British controlled Shanghai in China, they had signs up saying no dogs or Chinese allowed into cafes and into shops. I mean, this is offensive not just to working class Chinese, but to every Chinese person, however rich or powerful they might feel, however intellectual they might feel, however valued they might feel. They are immediately relegated to the level of an animal rather than the level of an equal human being. And this is and therefore, sensibility against oppression ranges much wider than just within the working class. In fact, very often, it may be more acute in other classes in society. And I think you could argue this is probably true, for example, in the women's movement of the 1960s, which I'll come on to talk about in a minute. It's true in a whole number of movements that actually middle class people or upper class people or even may find themselves particularly conscious of the oppression because it isn't part of a wider class oppression and exploitation. It's something which seems to affect them as individuals, but of course it isn't an individual question either. It's true that if you're a black person and you're abused in the street, this is carried out by an individual person, and that individual person is responsible for that level of oppression, the same as if a man rapes a woman is responsible for that particular oppressive act. But all of these oppressions are structured much more widely into the kind of society in which we live, and which assures that economic exploitation is bound up with the oppression of different groups of people, and their whole position in society is made worse worst by that. I say this because I think it's very important we don't just reduce oppression to something that the working class suffers, or indeed that is something that's the same all the time. You know, that there are different times when different aspects of oppression are more or less important. In the 1930s in Europe, Jewish oppression was far, far worse than anything that happened to a black or Asian person, because it was a systematic discrimination based on anti-Semitism, based on the hatred of the Jews, and we know where it ended up. It ended up with the Holocaust, and it ended up with Jews wiped out in countries like Germany. Now, the oppression of the Jews isn't at all the same today, although I must say I don't agree with David McNally's argument that Jews in America are no longer oppressed. I think that's absolutely a ludicrous argument. Actually, anti-Semitism is still a fact of life. But I mean, I would say today Islamophobia is the main form of racism and oppression with regard to race and so on in the West, in America and in Europe. But the truth is that if you're in parts of Eastern Europe, anti-Semitism is absolutely rife in countries like Poland still. I don't suppose they like Muslims very much either, but you know, there's a kind of, it's still very much there. Anti-Roma sentiment is very, very strong in some of the countries of Eastern Europe and so on. And therefore, you don't have to be centrally oppressed. You know, you don't have to be the main way in which they try and divide the rural working class to still be oppressed. But you also have to recognise that that means there are different times when different questions are more important. Well, 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't talk about Muslims as oppressed. We talked about Pakistanis or Bangladeshis or whatever it was. People didn't talk about Muslims as a group in this kind of sense. Now, it would be absolutely wrong to ignore the fact that the religion is one of the main ways that racism is used to divide the working class and so on. So, the oppression varies, and it can become something which is much less important as time goes on. I mean, again, if you look at the question of lesbians and gays, I mean, for example, in the 1950s in this country, gay men suffered very, very severe criminalisation, actually. I mean, the famous case of Alan Turing, the code breaker who killed himself, because people were criminalised, they were put in prison, they were threatened with prison, all this kind of thing. Now, that simply isn't the case today. It doesn't mean there isn't gay oppression. It does mean the whole thing has changed in terms of state oppression of gays and a certain sense of people living in big cities and living in certain ways and with a certain lifestyle. The oppression is much less in terms of there's a need for people to be able to live, which is one of the achievements of the movements of the 1960s, because the interesting thing about, how much longer have I got? Probably not much longer. 7 minutes. Okay, I have to whiz through the second half. Sorry, but there's always a lot to say on this topic. Now, of course, there have been movements against oppression going right the way back, and if you look at the 19th century, abolitionist movement by whites in America, but also black slaves and ex-slaves began to organise, and women organised around the same time. Interestingly, the women who campaigned for the vote from the mid-19th century in America called it the women's emancipation movement, in a direct reference to the emancipation of the slaves. That was why they did it. In the 1960s, when what's called the second wave, slightly sort of misleadingly in my view, the second wave of feminism and so on, hit in the 1960s, women's liberation took its name from the national liberation movements in Vietnam and in Africa and in different parts of the world, because people identified one group of the oppressed with another group of the oppressed, and they saw the things as connected. Now, in the 60s, you had all these movements coming forward. You had the civil rights movement in the Deep South, where lots of white people went to the South in order to campaign for civil rights. There were obviously lots of blacks involved who lived in the South, and there were white Southerners as well. But lots of people from the North went to the South, and it was out of the civil rights movement that came the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and also that came of course, Black Power and the Black Panthers, but also the women's movement. And the women's movement was very much in reaction to, and shows you actually there's no automatic unity of the oppressed, because the tensions between the black men, the white women and the black women in the southern states. I would recommend anybody to read this book by a woman called Sarah Evans called Personal Politics, who was herself a women's liberation and civil rights activist from the 1960s, and she's interviewed loads of people about the kind of tensions, and you see the kind of resentment of the black women against the white women who felt didn't do the same kind of street fighting as they did. You had the resentment because lots of the white women got off with black men, and that caused fantastic resentment, and the white women then resented the black men as well. The whole thing, you can see how it all starts going kind of bad and wrong in certain circumstances. And it's out of that the women's movement feels that men are not treating them quite rightly, they felt this, that men were not treating them with equality and with respect, and that they weren't playing a full part in the movement. And that's how you've got the women's movement. Now, what the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement and the black movement all achieved to a certain extent was they succeeded to a certain extent, but they only succeeded partly. What they succeeded in doing was essentially, if you think about the first wave, as it's called, was about women getting the vote. The second phase of the movement in the 1960s was about women getting legal equality, financial independence, so on and so forth. All of these things were still denied them right up to the 1960s, where you still couldn't get a mortgage if you were a woman, for example, without your father or your husband signing the form. You know, obviously undeveloped enough to be able to work out your own finances and all that kind of thing. So they achieved financial, legal, political equality. You know, the idea that women should be able to be prime ministers and drive a lorry and all the other kind of things that might seem, you know, completely archaic, that you couldn't do that, but nobody did do that at that time. But it was clear, I think, by the mid-70s or the late 70s, that the movements on their own, firstly, were going nowhere. I mean, I think the women's movement had a very short lifespan in the sense of anything that was creative and outgoing and growing. But it was also clear that they weren't on their own going to be enough, that they came up against the limits of class society. So you could achieve some women becoming bosses of companies, or some women becoming scientists, or becoming doing all sorts of individually useful and path-breaking jobs. But you couldn't break out of that basic relationship of exploitation. So what happens if you can't break out of it? You become part of it, and that's, you know, the process of the 80s and 90s was about incorporating a layer of blacks, of women, of lesbians and gays into the kind of sort of managing capitalism, and sometimes, you know, very enthusiastically managing capitalism, sometimes less enthusiastically managing it, but becoming part of either the ruling class or very, very close to, you know, the managers of the ruling class, if you like, those sorts of people. So there was a level at which opposition to oppression became the accepted discourse of society. I mean, it's like this now. You know, why on earth do we have a war in Afghanistan? Well, it's because women there just aren't equal and have to wear a veil over their heads. I mean, that's the, you know, the basic. So it's become absolutely accepted that a democracy like Britain, A, is a democracy, and B, stands for women's equality. Now, neither of these things, when you look at it, is true. But this is the kind of the dominant idea. Racism, you know, every company will have anti-racist policies, and every college you go to will have anti-racist policies, which at one level are very important and are taken very seriously. But so there's been that level of acceptance, but you look at institutional racism, what happens to black kids, you know, not all black kids, but lots and lots of black kids in education, what happens to them with the police, what happens to women in terms of job segregation and wages and all these things, doesn't really change very much. Doesn't really change. You know, there's a shift in how society looks, and in some ways there's important advances in society. If you look at girls going into higher education now, is equal more or less with boys. You know, in some ways the problem is the boys are underachieving and this kind of thing. But actually, you look at it and you say to yourself, has this really overcome the problem of oppression, or has oppression just re-emerged in different forms? I mean, that women still don't become the professors and all this kind of thing, and they still have, crucially, this responsibility for the family, the heart of their oppression being the family. Now, just to conclude very, very quickly, I would say if you look at the situation with oppression and exploitation, they're interlinked, they're absolutely intertwined, and therefore a fight against exploitation has also to be a fight against oppression, and therefore it isn't good enough for people to say, we're interested in strikes, or we're interested in this, but we're not interested in the war, or we're not interested in standing up for black people, or we're not, whatever the particular argument is at the time. It's also worth remembering that exploitation is a constant feat, and it's an absolutely fundamental of capitalism, whereas oppression is a fundamental of capitalism as well, except the way in which oppression operates varies at different times, and it is much easier to co-opt certain sections of the oppressed. I mean, I sometimes watch Channel 4 News and think, did people die in Mississippi to get Christian Guru Murphy on the bloody television reading the news? Because that's the level at which it gets co-opted, and the same is true with all the big struggles. And the reason it gets co-opted is because if you can't overthrow the system, if you can't fundamentally challenge the system, then you make your peace with the system, or a lot of people make their peace with the system. And therefore the conclusion I draw is that the fight against oppression has to be one that every socialist takes up. It's absolutely fundamental to our politics. I think probably all of us came into politics not because we understood the economic relationship with Marx talks about, but because we felt particularly angry about oppression of one form or another, injustice and inequality and all those kind of things. So it's absolutely vital that we do that, but it's also vital that any fight against oppression has to be linked to the fight against exploitation, has to say that we consciously make the links, not just about if you have one group of oppressed and another group of oppressed and a third group of oppressed, add them all together and you'll end oppression. You won't do that because there are conflicts between the oppressed. I mean, it's very, very clear, as I say, from this book and from a great deal else you can read about the conflicts. It isn't true even that the oppressed are always the people who are fighting against oppression. I mean, it's absolutely well known that a number of women, for example, in situations where there was change, for example in the Russian Revolution, a number of the older women clung to the old family and clung to the old way of living because the alternative looked much more frightening to them. So people quite often collude with their own oppression. It's not true that everybody fights against it. So the only way you can overcome oppression is not just by treating it as an individual thing, that you're going to do this, you're going to stand up for your rights, which is all the first step in overthrowing oppression, but also we have to see it as a fight to overthrow the exploitative society we live in. And particularly when you look at the family, which to me is one of the most oppressive institutions, I do not see that it is going to happen that the family and the way in which people have to live their lives in this narrow and isolated way is going to be overthrown without the overthrow of capitalism. So anyway, I'll end there and then, sorry for going on too long.
That's fine, you're on your own. Well, you could go, really. No, I'm sure we could have heard you for longer, but there you go. Okay, I'll just open it up to the floor for any questions or any contributions. Please don't feel afraid to ask a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of say that I agree with you in terms of the way in which oppression manifests itself now as opposed to the 1950s, talking about LGBT oppression. So we've seen, the Alan Turing's situations in this world this country are far gone. But I think the problem is now is that it's not as explicit, and I think that formulates its own problems because you're almost fighting against a silent enemy. You're looking at the oppression of LGBT people in the way that homophobic crimes are dealt with by the police, or the way that it's viewed by the greater media, or the way that if you walk down the street it's acceptable for somebody to say I'm gay, or to use the word faggot, or any of these things. I think it's the same sort of exemplified across all oppressed people. And I think it becomes then it's sort of a new struggle almost, fighting the implicit, institutionalised, socialised almost oppression of people, and it's kind of pointing it out to people and saying, well, no, it isn't acceptable. It isn't acceptable to use the word gay as means something derogatory. It isn't acceptable to use the N-word. It isn't acceptable to call people whatever. And I think it formulates its own specific problems that, in a way, we kind of need to identify and move forward with and try and challenge.
I just think it's important to emphasise the point that games that are won by our side, so to speak, they're won by social alliances or movements that are running contrary to the interests of capitalism. So when they are accepted, when games are won, it's not that they're won. It's not that the sort of capitalist class or ruling class think, oh yeah, you're right, I was wrong to oppress gay people, I was wrong. It just becomes, the social force has been created that you have to deal with. There's a degree of conciliation and management of society that the ruling class have to do to survive, or else they get thrown out. I mean, like Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Civil Rights Act, he also blocked a motion in the Republican Party to repeal anti-lynching law, to repeal pro-lynching law. So basically he was in favour of a law that would allow the lynching of black people in one of his constituencies, and he overturned attempts by Conservatives to get rid of that law. But he had to sign the Civil Rights Act because there was, it really was threatening the sort of structure of society. But these, and like the LGBT things, once a battle that was being won to a certain extent, the ruling class have to deal with that victory on the other side, and they have to incorporate. So it's uncomfortable for them, I think. And so that pressure still exists, bubbling away under the surface. Because it's hard to, although Jewish people were at the forefront of oppression by the fascists in the 30s, it's very hard to imagine that those fascists didn't have any negative opinions about black people or whatever, or gay people, clearly they did, and those people ended up in gas chambers as well. But it's really, these forms of oppression represent the strategic expediency of the ruling class, i.e. what is the point, what form of oppression most serves the goals of the ruling class. So obviously you can see why there was Jewish people in the 30s in the same way that it's Muslims now, So I think it's important to realise that all these social norms that are positive are like relics of a social struggle. And just the second point is about the cutting across of class. I mean, it's a kind of contradictory thing that's going on. I mean, in the Deep South, talking about the Deep South, there was the group of lawyers called the CCR, Centre for Constitutional Rights, who basically took up various civil rights lawsuits on behalf of, starting off for black people, but they also dealt with other forms of oppression. But it's interesting looking at their history that when they started off, I mean, legal business is very expensive, and they had very wealthy backers funding them from the get-go, and those people must have been essentially capitalists. The money was coming from capitalists. So I think it's quite interesting that there is that tension. But when you get those situations where essentially sections of the capitalists are sort of piling into they're putting their hands up and saying, yeah, we think this is wrong, this form of oppression. It's about who has the dominant role in that movement. So it's about like the working class so like the women's suffrage thing, there were middle class women who obviously agreed with that it was bad for women were oppressed, but the important thing was to try and make sure that that goal is never detached from the broader goals of like the working class movements as well.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, I mean, I thought, Lindsey's kind of one of the main points that you made, which I think was very important, was that while these sectional struggles can be very important, they can't be overcome as sectional struggles, and it kind of, there's parallels with the sort of the national liberation movements and what kind of I think Lenin was saying around the national question, which was that, you have to have solidarity with those national liberation movements, because they can actually pose real challenges to the whole sort of ruling order, and they can pose real challenges to imperialism, but they will always be limited, because what you actually need is an international, you need sort of international solidarity. You need kind of an international kind of working class movement, and that is the only thing that can actually really get rid of imperialism and ultimately oppressions of various kinds. So it seems to me, while obviously reforms are important and all the gains that we make are important, it seems to me that they can also be taken away. I mean, we can also, in certain cases, move backwards. And if that's the case, then the only solution really is to have a revolution that is much more kind of all-encompassing and actually does finally get rid of oppression altogether.
Yeah, I was just, from the readings and stuff that were sort of sent out, whenever it was Bambery, I remember going yesterday, and one of the questions that kept coming back up in them was this question of do men benefit from women's oppression, and why people benefit from racism and this kind of stuff. I mean, I broadly agreed with what you said earlier, which was that overall the working class, doesn't benefit, is actively kind of disadvantaged by it. But I don't know, one of the things I kept thinking was that there is obviously a huge short-term material benefit to kind of men, to white people out of racism and sexism. Obviously studies show that women still do 80 or whatever % it is of the housework, as well as working the same hours as men. So there is that material benefit there of men actually having kind of more leisure time, not being able to do that kind of stuff. And I was just kind of wondering, I guess, how you can both kind of, deal with that in any kind of women's movement or in discussions about kind of women's liberation, where at the same time emphasise the kind of broader problem that it poses to the working class. And the other thing was about, I guess, where the women's movement particularly is at now, because a lot of the stuff that's happened over obviously the past few years, things like Slut Walk and whatever, Reclaim the Night and these kind of demonstrations, is obviously good because they do get people talking about women's oppression and issues in a way they might not have done before, but they're broadly quite reactive campaigns against the kind of worst sexual forms of abuse, rather than kind of any sort of proactive discussion about women's oppression, in any other situations, like through Islamophobia or cuts or through anti-war activity and whatever. And I was wondering what you think, if you think there is any prospect for a broader women's movement, or is it better to concentrate that fight in the fight against austerity and war?
My thoughts coming out of the discussion are just how deliberate is oppression as a tactic for maintaining power. And if you look at, say, an issue like immigration, in the context of Britain, it's been extremely positive for the economy, extremely positive for growth, and extremely positive for the people who run the factories and things like that, to have that extra source of or a growing pool of labour. So you think that the people like the rich would be celebrating immigration, but then by fact of being rich and that division in wealth, they have to hold on to that power. So sometimes the only way to hold back that tide of not the 99% of the rest of the population is create divisions within that. And I suppose in relation to immigration in Britain, there was no greater division ever shown was when David Cameron said that multiculturalism had failed, and he said it in Nuremberg, Germany, on the day that the BNP had their biggest rally, or was it the National Front, or all of the above, had their biggest rally of the year, and so sort of came out, against, sane industrial policy of having continued growth through immigration and things like that. So I suppose having immigration allows you to make more money, but it doesn't allow you to stay in power, which would perhaps then require you to contribute your fair share in a mixed economy to society, and contribute your fair share to schools and hospitals and things like that, as opposed to what we're seeing is it going offshore or being squirreled away, and they don't contribute to society. So that's my observation.
I think John,
yeah, so make a couple of points. I mean, first of all, it's worth saying actually that class isn't just a relationship of exploitation. It's also an oppressive relationship. Working class people as a whole are oppressed. We're used to using the terminology as it applies to people who are singled out as minorities for one reason or another. But obviously what happens to you in the workplace isn't the end of the story. If you come from a working class background, you are also more likely to be arrested, more likely to be in prison, less likely to get into higher education. So all the forms of discrimination that we think of as normally applying to minorities also apply to working class people as a whole. Now, of course, if you're gay or black or a woman and working class as well, you get two forms of that experience. But it is an experience that stems out of the class relationship, as well as out of the differences among working class people. The second point is just about the thing that Ellie raised about the benefit. You see, this used to be a much more charged language. The debate about this, and I think it is now. But the kind of idea behind the Marxist left rejecting the idea of men benefiting, or whites benefiting, or the northern industrialised working class benefiting from colonialism was this really, as it came down to the question of where you draw the line in society, where you think the division lies in society. And you could take the view that men don't do the housework, and therefore they benefit. Or you can take the view that because of the oppression of women, the entirety of the working class experiences a depression in its living standards, its culture and so forth, which affects different sections of the class to a different degree, but affects the whole class to some degree. If you take that view, you tend to draw the line between the working class, despite its differences, despite the conflicts, despite the degree to which some people in the working class will support the structures of oppression, and the ruling class. If you draw it and say men benefit, or whites benefit, or the northern working class benefits, you tend to draw the line between groups of the oppressed on one side, and sections of the working class and the ruling class on the other side of that divide. So it tends to both isolate the oppressed and push certain sections of or treat certain sections of the working class as if they are part of the problem, as if they are actually benefiting from the capitalist system in a way that isn't accurate and is politically disabling, because if they were, that would be a problem that you could never solve. If they were structurally attached to the capitalist system in this way, why the hell would they ever end up fighting with it or struggling against it or siding with the oppressed? They wouldn't. They would be an integral part of it. So it's a sort of language that has a lot of kind of historical consequences. The final point I want to make is just about the pattern in the last, in the post-war period, because sometimes when we look back and you read what the Bolsheviks said or what Kollontai said or so forth, there is a lot of very powerful lessons that we should draw from that, and it's a fantastic heritage. But there is this difference between their world and ours. In their world, the oppression of women was almost universal, including very large sections of the middle class, and no woman had the vote until 1920. No woman had the vote at all until just after the war, and there wasn't universal suffrage as a whole for all women until 1928. The entire world was European colonies, virtually. There had never been a successful black liberation movement. Now in the 60s, something changed. There was wholesale decolonisation, there was an absolutely huge black liberation movement, and there was an absolutely huge women's movement. And part of the way we live in a different world, as Dan said, is because those achieved some partial victories. And it's important to mark that as well. But what also happened in all these cases is that a section of the anti-colonial struggle became the state power in the third world countries. A section of the women's movement became successfully integrated into the system, and a section of the black movement became, mostly middle class blacks, became part of the establishment. So when the next set of riots after the 60s took place in America, it was often black mayors who sent in the National Guard to shoot down black protesters in the inner city ghettos. That wasn't true before the 60s. And that's a difference that we have to contend with. A section of the oppressed, precisely because of the success in the movements of the 60s, have been integrated into the system in the way that they weren't before that period.
Shall I come back? Yeah. I mean, just a few points before we go on to other things. I mean, the point was made about the sort of silent oppression of LGBT and indeed of all sorts of other people, I think is absolutely true. One of the problems, I think, with oppression is that people very often internalise it because you think it's you, or you think nobody else thinks like you, or, you know, somebody attacks you in a racist way, you think it may, I mean, as people in America did, they used to straighten their hair for years before the 60s. They would try and have whiter skin and straighten their hair and not look black, you know, that was, and one of the things about black power was people started wearing the Afro haircut, which was, you know, a deliberate political statement, which became a sort of mass cultural phenomenon that people were reacting against that. But for many years people did that. For many years people did all sorts of things. And certainly in the 50s and 60s, many, well, some gay people and lesbian people still do not publicly come out, but then it was absolutely commonplace that people, particularly men, would, you know, pretend that they were heterosexual and had very, very miserable, lonely lives and very sort of double, you know, two different kind of lives going on at the same time, a sort of secret one and so on. So I think that's that, and I also agree with you that, you know, there's a public sort of acceptance of equality, but actually that doesn't stop all sorts of cultural and social phenomena making it much worse. I think, for example, in this country, the problems in schools with questions about LGBT is a very large problem, which governments don't do very much about. A few teachers, you know, there are some teachers who've done a lot of campaigning, but it's clear there's a lot of homophobic stuff, particularly from young boys, but generally among a lot of teenage kids, which isn't really dealt with, isn't talked about. Whereas that wouldn't now probably be tolerated in some of these schools over race, for example. So, you know, these are things we have to keep fighting about. The point that Dan made about Jewish people being the main target, but that also obviously blacks would have been a target, that's absolutely right. I mean, the reason Jews were the main target was because actually they were a very big minority. Actually, I mean, they were big in Germany, but even bigger in Russia and Poland. You know, they're a very big, visible minority who tended to live in separate parts of towns and things like that. And of course, there was a very small black population in Europe at the time. It's, you know, minuscule in most places. I mean, my mother always said to me, in this country, the only black person she ever saw before the end of the Second World War was a guy, an Indian, who used to come around the village in Cambridgeshire wearing a turban, and the kids used to go around the village laughing. I mean, you know, not particularly unpleasantly, but this was a sort of strange phenomenon that people hadn't seen. So of course, when you're talking about the concentration camps, of course it isn't just the Jews. Actually, it's not firstly the Jews, it's firstly the trade unionists and the socialists and the communists. And then there's all sorts of other people, gay and lesbians, people they regarded as degenerate in any way, the term that they used, disabled people, Roma, gypsies, all of these were people who were targets, and no doubt any black people who happened to be unfortunate enough to be in their path, you know. And I think you also have to say today, if you think about a similar situation, there's no question the Muslims would be the main scapegoat, and we're already seeing elements of them having to control what they wear and all this kind of thing. But of course, I think if you did have real serious fascism in Europe again, you would also have anti-Semitism and attacks on the Jews. You know, I'm always struck by how anti-Semitic fascists remain, despite the fact that, you know, they moved on to Muslims and Afro-Caribbeans and all sorts of other people in the post-war world. So I think it's still there, and we should recognise it's still there in that sense. I agree with what people say about class. And what Facey says about national liberation, I think is absolutely true. It can be taken away as well. But also, you know, the experience of national liberation. I mean, you know, if you think of Mugabe, and Mugabe was such a great figure in the 70s. There's no question. I mean, I was so happy when ZANU. I mean, I knew lots of people from ZAPU and ZANU and that when I was at college, because lots of them were in exile. They're extremely brave people, they're extremely courageous people, and so on. And then you get this vile regime that you've got now, you know, and it's an absolute, and that happens again. If you cannot really confront the structures of power, you become like them, and that's what happened with Gaddafi. They got rid of the minority rule, the whites being the only people who had the vote, and that was a big step forward. But now the whole country's sort of gangsterised, and you know. So I think you have to be really aware that this can happen. Ellie's point about men benefiting. I mean, John's answered some of it. See, I'll put it like this: if, for example, you had in this country 35-hour week for everybody and free childcare, who would that benefit? It would benefit everybody. I mean, actually, it would benefit men more in terms of reduction of hours, because by and large, they work longer hours, but it would benefit absolutely everybody. If you have free childcare, it doesn't just benefit the woman, it benefits everybody. And so, you see, I don't think you can kind of quantify it in terms of men, you know, getting, I don't know, it's like, you know, do they get an extra 2 hours a day when they stick their feet up and watch the telly and while the women are arming? Well, there's undoubtedly some men, probably quite a lot of men who do. It's also true that in general, what you find with couples within the family who've got children, that actually the man normally works longer hours outside the home, which, okay, is probably better than sitting doing the ironing. I'm not, you know, I don't want to get into a sort of value judgment about it. I think actually being a housewife is one of the most miserable and hard things you can do, and I think looking after children is one of the most difficult jobs that you can do. But I don't think you can see it in terms of them getting a benefit. I think it's a kind of hideous division of labour that you've got at the moment, where, you know, somehow they have to deal with getting an income and looking after the children and doing whatever else you have to do around the home, you know, all this kind of thing. And it is divided up in a gender-specific way. I mean, if you earn 80% of men, it makes sense for you to have a part-time job and the man to have a full-time job, if that's a choice. If somebody has to look after the kids when they're sick, which is nearly always the woman who takes the day off, then in a way it's logical if they're earning less money or if their job isn't so valuable. So the whole thing becomes a kind of vicious circle, you know. And I don't think it's in anybody's benefit. The same as I don't think, I mean, to put it, I mean, perhaps the family, because it's about, obviously, individual relationships in a way that perhaps other oppressions aren't quite so much. You know, you think of the Deep South in America. The lowest wages for whites in America were in the Deep South, and that's because the blacks earned even less. Well, they were slaves for a long time, but then when they were freed from slavery, they still earned less than the whites. So in other words, the racism and the segregation weakened and disadvantaged the whole working class. Whereas in the North, where you have much less segregation, then actually you had higher wages, better housing, all this kind of thing. So I think, you know, you have to look at it overall, and the big beneficiaries are the capitalist class. I think it's absolutely, yeah, they are making an absolute fortune out of what people do for love. That's what the family's about, is people doing all this stuff. You know, working to get their kids Christmas presents, caring for them, doing all this stuff. And they do it for love. And, you know, that's a very nice emotion. But the people who are getting the workers at 16 or 18 or 21 to make their profits are paying virtually none of this, and they're maintaining an exploitative relationship to do so. Sorry, just two other questions. Ellie's other question about slutwalking. I mean, I've got something of a problem with the kind of new women's movement, which actually somebody, this woman who wrote a book on Iraq was pointing to, and that I interviewed for my book on women, who said really it doesn't take into account race at all, which was kind of understandable maybe 40 or 50 years ago, it isn't understandable now, and particularly it doesn't take into account Muslim women, and therefore I think any movement of women has to take into account this question, and it has to take into account class. I mean, I spoke at the HN conference a couple of years ago with some woman who I denounced people who employed people to look after, you know, to clean their houses. I mean, like you have to pay for childcare, which you have to do in this society. I don't blame you for doing that. But she said to me afterwards, I couldn't possibly manage without my nanny. And you feel like saying, and this is kind of left-wing academic, you feel like saying, well, what do you think your nanny's doing? Because half of them have got kids in the Philippines or something that their mums are looking after. And, you know, I mean, it's quite incredible sort of things. So I think class and race, and when that's come up in the women's movement, it's been a very sharp division, you know, if you look at various kind of times. Will there be a women's movement as such? Who knows? I mean, it's very hard to know what the issues might be. I do think war and austerity have been the things that have mobilised very large numbers of women, obviously not exclusively women. Maybe that's the way it will go. Maybe people will feel they want the space to have women-only discussions and so on. But I think in lots of ways, women are not like they were in the 60s. You know, they're much more educated, they're much more confident actually. I mean, I was thinking about young women now, are much more confident than women in the 60s. You might not feel like it, but it's true. I'm sure it's true, you know. I'm sure it's true of Ellie, but anyway, it's probably true of other people as well. But you know, I think just generally the level of consciousness and education and so on has made a big difference to women. And the final point about immigration, Paul's point, see, it's a very weird thing about immigration. Bans on immigration make no sense economically, right? And if you read The Economist magazine, The Economist is a huge fan of abolishing immigration controls, even though it's very right-wing ruling class, or precisely because it is right-wing ruling class, it thinks it can move capital anywhere and it should be able to move labour anywhere. It doesn't want anything getting in the way of this. But it's constantly banging on because no government ever abolishes immigration controls, and they don't because it's probably it's the nastiest way today that the working class is divided, no question. Going back to, I mean, it's really only since the Second World War this has been a big issue, but it has been a big issue all my lifetime. It was a huge issue when I was growing up, you know, and that's when they introduced all these immigration laws. And it was really, really nasty a lot of the time, and it's still, as people know, it still is very, very nasty. Different things. So it seems to me, even though this goes against their best interest, even though this country is ageing and not reproducing itself and needs immigrants on a massive scale to produce wealth in this country, the contradiction between what they need economically and how they can divide and rule politically means this is going to continue to be a big debate, in my view, until revolution, really, you know.
Thank you, Lindsey. Is there any more contributions or any questions people would like to ask? Can you follow up on what Lindsey said? No?
Well, just as one final to add to that, also, if we look at neoliberalism, I mean, in the 60s and 70s, there came up a problem with labour was very strong in the post-war period, and there was a problem with not enough labour, so that they started to introduce immigration to undercut labour and cheaper work, but more profits, because there was a crisis of productivity in the system. But they also, alongside using immigration to solve the problem of profitability, they also started outsourcing. And it was in the interest of the capitalist class to bring in immigrants and to push out work overseas, which creates a kind of cognitive dissonance in the ruling class, who are basically racist, because then they need to sort of do this. And so that might mean that certain sections of the ruling class are strategically more open to this idea about equality. You know, I don't know what people think about that, but you know, if it does temporarily, if immigration temporarily works in the favour of the capitalist class, they might be more open to accepting ideas about equality, like in the EU. And that's the big thing about the EU. When it was working, it's supposed to be that you can travel across borders, because it was in the interest of quite high mobility of different sections of the workforce across Europe to undercut labour and all the rest of it. And now that's kind of a whole neoliberal project is grinding to a halt. You've suddenly got the doors being shut again. which creates, again, this tension comes back to the front, back to the fore. People are trying to wind back these gains. When you have in the Tory party who've been trying to clean up their act, and that's part of Cameron's thing. But it creates a lot of anger in the backbenchers who want, what's that woman name? Doreen, Norris, who want, she's like, represents this counter-attack, pushing back any social gain. So you can see even a conflict within the ruling class as to how egalitarian do we need to be strategically to stay in power. So it can get quite messy, I think, Luke.
I was going to say, well, maybe too cynically, but in terms of immigration, maybe the implementation of caps on immigration and continue, sort of stopping people coming into this country, despite the fact that it's kind of counterproductive for the increasing wealth of the ruling classes, could be the fact that when you have a lot of people come over to this country, it's going to exacerbate and show the deep social issues that are inherent within, for the working classes of this country. And so, in order to not sort of bring things like the dire state of housing, the lack of schools being oversubscribed, hospitals, etc., that cap on immigration almost serves to keep the working classes quo, to sort of stem their consciousness almost to a certain extent.
Just a thought came back about the need of the ruling class to create these divisions and in order to rule. And I suppose the other one is that the Tories got an absolute drubbing in the local